Thanks so much. And others have said, who would have ever thought that we would be having a supply chain conversation here at District Winery in the morning in DC? I used to make a joke that I had the least sexy job in town. Supply chain policy is not the thing that normally, gets people up in the morning. Maybe that's, a credit to the avocado toast, as others have mentioned too. But we're really excited to convene this conversation today. Supply chains are an issue that impact every American every day. The Consumer Brands Association represents food, beverage, household, and personal care manufacturers, the types of products that the average American relies on, by our estimates, 42 times a day at least. I know that in my household we have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. That number is much, much higher. Just from a convenience standpoint, from an affordability standpoint, these are the products that really power the everyday. And I really want to also thank Semafor and Steve for facilitating today's conversation, for Representatives Blunt Rochester and Johnson for joining us, and later you'll hear from Representative Malinowski, and well as some folks from the National Economic Council. So really excited about the conversation that we're having today and the focus that's been given to supply chain. Sean is the Executive Director of the Shippers Coalition. Consumer Brands is a member of that organization. And I think between the two of us, we probably see eye to eye on a lot of the issues that are impacting just the supply chain and how to facilitate that, how to make that undergirding infrastructure of how we get, receive, purchase things that ensure the availability of those products, how to make that system work better. If I'm explaining the supply chain to someone, I often sort of compare it either to the health of your own body or the health of the economy, right? This is something that we all take for granted, but what you put in is what we sort of get out of it. So the degree to which we invest in it, the way that we nurture it, the way that we take care of that supply chain, that ultimately is then connected to our economic prosperity, to our national security, just to the ability for you and I to go to the grocery store during COVID and get toilet paper or baked beans or whatever the heck we were trying to get. And so the same issues that impacted us then continue to impact us today. Demand for consumer products alone is much higher even than it was during those panic buying months of March 2020. And it's a credit and a testament really to the private sector for stepping up and being able to meet the needs of consumers. But this is not something that can just we can't just go from crisis to crisis to crisis and keep expecting that the private sector comes through and we're just sort of well, thank goodness that we responded to that crisis. Obviously, it's important to respond in those moments, but this is something, an issue that I think we can really get ahead of. And I think that's what we're going to talk a little bit about, which is, Sean, tell me more about what this next Congress inherits, what's on their plate, as we've gone from crisis to crisis. We just got done with some rail strike talks, averted that, thank goodness. But tell me, sort of prognosticate this out a little bit.
Sure. Thanks, Tom. And as Tom said, Executive Director of the Shippers Coalition, 80 plus members, CBA is a member. We have PepsiCo, Home Depot, Coca-Cola, a lot of food, dairy, agribusiness companies who move heavy goods around the country. And I think some of the themes you've continued to hear today is this is a complex issue. We like to say on our side of the equation, there's no one size fits all solution for this. There's no silver bullet. We work in a multimodal space, and I think as Tom and I have joked in the past, a lot of the issues we worked on weren't necessarily the sexiest issues. My background was I started my first job on the railroad subcommittee, worked for former chairman Bill Schuster on the transportation committee. Those issues I think a lot of folks in this room pay attention to in the business world and the VP and supply chain and logistics sides. But COVID kind of heightened that and demonstrated that there were major deficits in the system. It became front page news. It's something that's talked about day in and day out. I think a lot of us were used to getting things immediately. I know this morning I was upset that I couldn't get a Tide pen within an hour when my son spilled formula on my pants. And so we've taken things for granted. And as Congress is looking towards the next legislative session, I think there is opportunity in a divided government. When there's one party rule, it's difficult for industry to sometimes cooperate and be able to move things that are favorable to industry. And so from our perspective, what we take on as the preponderance for us is an education and advocacy campaign. yes, everyone is concerned about the supply chain, but what does that actually mean? How does that impact day-to-day consumers? And what are realistic solutions? And so we talk a lot about things that can happen in the short term. I think the administration in good faith tried to look at some of those items, but there are medium-term and long-term solutions as well. And so our organization, we represent the shippers. We talk a lot about what Congressman Johnson was just talking about with the truck driver shortage. There's a retirement and a retention issue there. We're going to lose over 1 million drivers over the next decade. And so there are barriers to entry as we try and recruit new truck drivers in that space. It's a quality of life issue. I think it was extremely heightened during COVID. There was issues with parking. It's a tough job. And so what are things that industry can do? What are the things that the federal government can actually lean in on that isn't this, pie in the sky silver bullet, but, doing things like creating a federal grant program. Those schools for truck drivers can often cost $10,000. And so there are many other companies and industries that have grant programs like that. That is something we consider low-hanging fruit. I think you can get bipartisan buy-in. Another component we work on is gross vehicle weight limits. This is an issue that's been going on since the 1980s. And our coalition has really worked hand in glove with Congress, with the administration, with the previous DOT and this DOT to try and raise awareness as these trucks are leaving the ports, factories, and warehouses 2/3 of the way full. And so if they have the ability to raise the gross vehicle weight limits on federal roads, you can increase the efficiencies, you can reduce the wear and tear on pavement, you can reduce carbon and particle emissions. And so approaching it from a holistic perspective, I think, is the most important thing. But again, there's an education divide. There are 74 new members of the House, 7 new members of the Senate. They hear a lot about the supply chain, but what does that mean besides the toilet paper shortage, the formula shortage? How else is that impacting everyday consumers? And it's upon folks like you and I and everyone else in this room to go out and educate these new members and demonstrate, how this is impacting real world constituents for them.
Right. Well, it's clear that you sort of need this mix of both almost like philosophical, transformative policy solutions, Representative Blunt Rochester and others in the House working on this idea of an office of supply chain or building out more of an industrial strategy to how we approach these issues in America. So you need that overlay of a strategic viewpoint. But you also need very practical solutions, whether it's gross vehicle weight limits, whether it's even just tariff reductions in the short term. Like, how do you take costs out of the equation? How do you facilitate and make things just run smoother? The other example I'd be like, if supply chain is in your body, like it's kind of like I bike a lot, and a clean drivetrain, or being able to just take some of that friction out, having things run smoothly on time. That's so critical for our economy. It's critical for consumers, and it's something ultimately that we take for granted. We also saw, though, that despite all of the attention that was given to supply chain, despite the fact that it was tabletop, conversation, that it was in front page of the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, this Congress didn't move pieces of legislation forward like Representative Blunt Rochester's. What gives you confidence, especially heading into that divided Congress, that we might see some traction? And talk us through a little bit in the minute we have left.
Sure. I think we all recognize that Congress doesn't operate under immediate deadlines. I like to wait until the last minute. We should give credit where credit is due. Congressman Johnson with the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, that was a big step in the right direction. We're closely monitoring implementation of that from the administration. But I think there's opportunity with the divided Congress, particularly in the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Last Congress, it was an extremely partisan process. It was a top-down driven from leadership. If you talk to future Chairman Graves and I think to be Ranking Member Larson, they both talk kind of speaking on the same language. They talk about returning the T&I committee to bipartisanship, something that committee has not really operated under in a while. And so I think being able to see a pathway towards bipartisan victories for both sides, that both sides can go home and say they are doing something for their constituents and not in this one-party rule, I think is quintessential to success in this space.
I think that's absolutely right. Well, thank you, Sean, and most importantly, thank you all to our attendees today, the Consumer Brands Association, and I think I can speak on behalf of the Shippers Coalition as well, that we look forward to working with you on these issues in the year to come. We invite your questions to future panelists, but thank you again for joining us today and taking part in this important conversation on fixing America's supply chain.
Thank you.